Welcome to L'Arte Dell Armi, the Bolognese podcast where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life.
Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you. This is the first time that Stephen and I are doing an interview together. So, Stephen, welcome to doing interviews.
Hey, I'm super excited, Joshua.
Yeah. So to kind of kick this thing off, Greg, one of the first things that we kind of wanted to talk about to kind of set we've already given your general introduction, gotten your background in a previous episode of L'Arte Dell Armi. So we want people to go back and listen to that one. But, we wanted to kind of kick this one off with an approach to pedagogy and teaching.
Okay.
One of the things that we wanted to ask right up front to kind of set the tone for our conversation today is, CSG has a really well-defined pedagogical progression. And we were kind of wondering what it takes to take a student from beginner to advanced practitioner, and what are some of the biggest hurdles of taking a student into that latter progression?
Sure. Okay. Oh, that's a nice simple question to get everything started off with, right? Okay. So, so the CSG was founded in '99, so we're at 23 years of history now, right? And so over that 23 years, I'd say what we've tried to do and what we've expected has changed quite a bit. Like I suspect any group cropping up now, we started off by, okay, let's reconstruct these techniques and just follow the book page by page, and we'll get results. And you will get results, but you won't actually necessarily get pedagogically sound ones. And what I mean by that is that any fencing manual, even ones written in the 19th century, which are really written, as training guides, is like any good plan, right? It falls apart in first contact with the enemy, which in this case is the student. But when you start getting into the 16th century, the 15th century, or in a couple cases the 14th century, that's not even how these books are being written. So to try to think that you're just going to follow the manual and do these plays, and you're going to take someone who knows nothing about anything, and you're going to get a good result is delightfully naively ambitious. And I'm not saying that pejoratively for anybody, because I have been delightfully naively ambitious on many occasions. But so what we realized was that, or over time, was that there's a couple things. If you're doing a deep dive into one of these martial arts, you're going to see that there's recurring themes, recurring principles, that kind of create your foundational actions, right? They're your foundational mechanics, your foundational techniques, that tactics can then be built on. And so what you want to do is you want to pick things that are going to refine and ingrain that into muscle memory without giving the students a million things to learn. So since this is a Bolognese podcast, let's keep it on Bolognese. Okay.
Yeah, we'll keep it saucy.
We'll keep it very saucy, and I like my sauce spicy. So, all right. So let's say I'm cracking open, Marozzo or Montellino, right? And I go, oh, hey, look, there's this big assalto for sword and buckler. Okay, so we'll start off by making this dude who just walked in the door learn this gigantic assalto, okay? Which is sort of like what would happen if you say you walked into any Tai Chi class in America right now. Here's the first form, we're going to teach you the form. And maybe they'll learn it, and maybe they'll be able to replicate it, in a year or so. Maybe they'll be able to replicate it faithfully. But will they be able to do anything with it? And that's the real question. So you could look at it another way, and Marozzo himself alludes to this in his prologue, right? Which is, well, if the guards, the steps, and the blows are the foundations of the art, then what I should do is I should look at a way to teach them the guards, the steps, and the blows, so that they can execute them, and they can stand on them, they can frame them instinctually. And so most people figure that out pretty quickly, right? Okay, so I need some simple cutting drills. I need some simple footwork drills. I need to practice guards. But what we found is that over the years we went from having a lot of different drills to do these different things to just having a couple. And our Bolognese curriculum isn't quite this tight, but like on our Armazzari curriculum, for example, we have 3 core cutting drills that students learn in our intro class. And those are designed, and I'll break them down for you. One of them is designed to teach them how to execute a descending cut, right? The other one is designed to teach them how to use rising falsi. And the third one is designed to teach them how to use the guard posta di finestra, right? For those who don't know Armazzari, basically guardia di croce. But they're not just designed to do that, they're also designed to provide tactics. So the first drill is really designed to teach you at the same time that when you execute a counterattack, there's only a couple things you can do. You either move into an attack, you move away from an attack. So you either get it before it's in full force, or you move away and forward on the circumference, so you get it when it's losing power. You slip an attack and overrun it. Or the fourth action, if you're too slow to actually counterattack them, you redirect and you attack their sword, right? And you create a beat on the weapon. And so that provides a tactical framework for how you counterattack. And so at the same time they're learning how to cut, they're also learning how to move in those elements. And then the individual plays that come out of that are showing them how to do that against an opponent. But then, for example, what's the next thing we do with that? We then plug in different guards. So instead of just learning how from, again, I'll try to keep it in Bolo terminology, from Guardia Alta, I'm going to learn how to counterattack with a Mandrito Squalembrato in these 4 ways. Well, now I'm learning how to do that from an Alla Corno, or I'm learning how to do that from what happens when I'm in, like, Coda Longa Stretta and I have to make a preparation to do this, right?
Yeah.
How's that change the tempo? And then you can take it even further and say, okay, well, now what about if I'm going to make a true edge rising cut from here, and same movement form. So now they're learning a whole different cut, but they're still learning the same tactical framework. So what starts as these 3-4 step drills then becomes a framework to teach them a whole bunch of different actions that's marrying tactics to technique, so that they start to realize, oh, there's only so many ways I can move. And I find this is really important with something like Bolo, where if you get lost into the footwork, it has more footwork than any other art any of us study, right? The number of the cross steps, the triangle steps, there's
Right.
just so many different permutations of the steps too.
It's a dancing martial art with some swords so that you can do something while your feet are moving.
Yeah, pretty much. That's pretty much exactly right. And so, you can make someone lose their mind with that and feel totally overwhelmed. Or you can try to figure out how to create a few core actions that are going to teach them how to move in a Bolognese way, how to just instinctually move from guard to guard, and how to do that through a dynamic transition, aka a blow, right?
Yeah.
And when you do all of that, are they going to know, all of Monciolino's Book 4? No. But are they going to be able to move in a Bolognese way with some instinctual tactical understanding? Yes. And then that creates the scaffolding you build on. So that's kind of how we've developed it here. And we do the same thing when we teach wrestling. We do the same thing when we teach dagger. We have some core skills, some core drills that everything is meant to layer upon.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've been taking a similar approach. I took one of Marazzo's sort of, I don't know, I guess you could say, kind of dumb phrases that he uses all the time, right? You always see at the beginning of his plays when he says your opponent, it can only deliver a mantrito or a reverso or a stoccata, right? And those are the natural blows.
Right.
And he repeats himself over and over again. He says it all the time. But I think there's actually a lot of wisdom behind that, because, like you said, understanding that no matter what guard your opponent is in, they can only deliver, X, Y, and Z blows. What I actually took the framework, because I've been studying Fiore on the side. I know I'm a heretic, but I've been studying Fiore on the side.
You want to waste your time, go ahead.
For the last year and a half. And so I actually took this from Fiore because I thought that Fiore's pedagogical approach was pretty interesting. And I feel like it fits really well with Manciolino in that I've been doing the exact same thing with my students. When I look at Manciolino's attacks, um, I see book one of Manciolino and his basic attacks as provocations and attacks that you can do to basically set up what is the true art, which is book three, which is going into Mezzospada, right? And that matches
Hmm.
perfectly with what Fiore does, right? Because,
Yep.
Fiore is basically just trying to get you to the center line so that way you can initiate some sort of a grapple or an offensive action off of that.
Hmm.
And I think that you can take that same strategy into Manciolino, and that's really what I've been working on. Um, so, yeah, I totally see that, and I agree with that a lot.
Yeah,
So
I
I'm.
yeah. Go ahead, Stephen. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say the one thing that gives me pause about this is
Hmm.
that Moroto describes using the first assalto as a way to teach new fencers,
Hmm.
and I kind of wonder, can we really be claiming to be teaching a legitimate historical martial art when we ignore that and go off to the side and
Sure.
kind of
Oh,
start doing stuff that we want to do
I'm
or
so
based on
glad.
that stuff?
I'm so glad you asked that because I have a perfect, slightly snarky answer to that. So I'm going to begin by saying the following: Achille Marozzo is dead, as are all these other masters. And so the first thing that everybody should understand is you are never going to do Marozzo because, as I said in my last interview, although I said it about Fiore, only Mrs. Marozzo did Marozzo. Okay, so okay,
Moroto is forever, man.
right, right, and I have an essay that I haven't posted yet, but I will, because shortly after the Bolo event up in Vancouver, there was someone pontificating rather fluidly and floridly about how I'm so sick of hearing about this frog DNA. I don't use frog DNA. I don't want frog DNA. I don't like this use of other language that isn't in Bolognese. Then, if that's really true, you had best only teach in Italian. And I don't mean just your technical terminology, I mean your language in Italian. You certainly better be fluent in Italian because our community creates jargon where there was none. And you better accept that you're not actually teaching anything, you're simply aping instructions that were left behind you. So now that I said that and I was really snarky, what do I mean by that? Okay, so um, I can say that I'm not going to use anything that isn't in the book. Okay, great. Do you exhale when you cut or do you inhale? You can't answer that outside the book. Now, everyone would say, well, I mean, obviously you exhale when doing work. Really? In some Chinese martial arts, you inhale in internal arts.
Maybe
So
there's doesn't really matter what you're doing.
maybe it does because without oxygen in your blood, you're going to gas pretty
Right. So
quickly,
you just
right?
keep breathing.
Sure.
Period.
Or,
Yeah.
how do you shift your weight?
Right.
It's really precise footwork. How do you shift your weight? There's this idea that Vigiani somehow isn't part of the Bolo tradition. And yet, like you just said, much like Marozzo, he says there's only three blows, a mandrito, a reverso, and a thrust, right?
Yep.
And he couldn't be that critical of the Bolognese pedagogy without being well versed in it. But my point here isn't that you shouldn't do the assalto. It's that we don't know that what he means by a new student. What he says is that when you get a new student, don't put them in the classroom with the other students until they've learned the following. So what he's really telling you is that you should learn by private lesson the steps, the cuts, the guards, right? And oh, by the way, don't let friends train together because it'll be a disaster
Right.
if they come in together, which is decidedly true.
And
Um,
he does say not to take your beginning students and put them with advanced students right away.
exactly,
That's in the lead up.
exactly,
Well,
exactly.
he says they should be taught by your senior students of a nice disposition. So
Right,
not
but
your Guido Rangonis and Hugo
Right.
Papolis, but some
But
nice
but
guy.
what he's basically saying is your provost or someone assigned by your provost should teach them.
Right.
yeah.
And he's really following, ironically enough, very similar to what is the modern method of the fencing lesson, which is that they usually introduce newbies by private lesson, then you put them in a basics group class, and then the group class ends, and it goes all back to the private lesson.
Right.
Very different than what we do in HEMA, which is much closer to how modern Asian martial arts are taught with big group classes.
Yeah, one
So,
thing that Moranzo does though, and it's in his guard progression in the middle of his second book, right? Where he gives the progression of guards and he says, this is how you should teach your students. So actually he does follow
hmm
Greg's pedagogical approach where he's telling you to have your student form Codalonga Alta, right? Or I think it starts with Codalonga Stretta. And then he says, teach them all the cuts, all the different attacks from that guard, and then teach them the defenses from that guard, and then have them move into this position, and you're going to have them cut forward, and they're going to step into, I think, Cinghiari Porta de Ferro. And then he says, okay, this is the tactical consideration that you need to make for this guard, and these are the attacks, the defenses. These are the things you're going to teach your student, and then once they're ready for that, you test them on what they know of Codalunga Stretta and Porta de Ferro or Cinghiari Porta de Ferro Stretta, and then have them move on into the next guard.
yeah,
So he does basically go through that same progression, and I
yeah,
think in that there is something of him eventually taking that into, hey, here's the sword and small buckler form. Learn how to move now.
yeah, and it's funny you should say that because in a way, that one little passage that people always remember the part about the passeggiare in La Guardia, right?
Yeah.
In La Guardia. My Italian's failing me today. But anyway, about the moving and the guards, but they ignore the part where he actually says that, okay, teach them a guard, now teach them what to do from the guard, now teach them the guard. In many ways, he's giving you, when you're all done, the solo walking form of what is all of Moncellino's book one, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And right, and Moncellino's giving you the lesson.
Yeah.
He's giving you the form, and Moncellino's giving you the lesson, which took me the longest time to notice because I kind of just had glanced through that and didn't think about it, and it wasn't until a much later reread of Marozzo I was like, oh wait a minute, um, Moncellino isn't that unique. He's just writing out what Marozzo told you to do, and yeah, and so yeah, I'm not saying that the assalti aren't important. I'm actually a big believer in the value of the assalti. Um, but what I'm saying is that if you don't have the skills to understand what are in the assalti, let alone to do them, um, they're arguably not that valuable. I learned a whole bunch of Tai Chi forms, and I learned a whole bunch of bullshit for what a lot of it meant. Some of those actions I didn't learn until studying Armazari what they were really for. And I can tell you right now, like the number of people on this continent who could tell you what a Tai Chi sword form is meant to do are very, very small. I mean, Scott Rodell's pretty much spent his whole, career trying to get people to believe that the Chinese sword can be used properly. And that's just in part because what most people have seen is what one of my teachers called wave hands make pretty. Um, but so there's a real danger of it becoming that.
Yeah.
There's plenty of video of people doing assaulti out there, or one of the things that's very popular right now is people doing flow drills, spontaneous flow drills, and I'm not against that at all, but it's sometimes sometimes my Insta feed is filled with this, and they're moving very prettily, but like their edge alignment sucks, their arm extension isn't necessarily very good. I can't tell what they're trying to target. So what are you doing? What exactly are you doing? What martial virtue does it have other than making you feel comfortable with the sword? And I would argue it has none. It's very pretty, and that has its own virtue. But I think if you divorce it from a very direct, concrete application, you're just kind of you're stuck. You can get stuck in the weeds.
Yeah,
So
you get sword jazzercise.
exactly,
Yep.
and or baloney bow. So so I guess what I'm saying is just to kind of to pull this home. I would still teach the assaulti, and we certainly do use a number of those things. And like when we start someone with sword alone, Delagoquier's two different solo forms are in there right away because they're
so
probably
basic.
Yeah,
they're so basic.
walking in the
And-
guards progress. Yeah,
yeah,
defending in
and
the
you
guards.
literally can stick, and I've told people before, if you've got someone who's just kind of you got to give them a quick course in buckler. The nice thing about those is you could stick any secondary arm in the guy's hands,
Yep.
and you can do it with a two-handed sword, right? Like if I just need something simple, it works. So certainly those sorts of things, Morozzo's progressions, those are all part of those fundamentals. I just think the full assaulty, which are far more complex and are really a curriculum in microcosm, those shouldn't be where you try to start. So
Yeah, and I think so. The piece that I wrote about satyrs and nymphs and going through Manciolino's progressions, that was kind of the point that I was trying to get at, right? Like Manciolino starts out with book one teaching you the basics. He teaches you um, all the attacks and then the counters to those attacks, and then he teaches you the guards, and then he progresses into all of his his wide play assaulty, right? And they're a full progression of play. So it's like you teach a student how to move with a sword martially and how to attack martially, and you teach them about provocations and the core elements that they need to know, and then you teach them how to move well, right? But the whole purpose of teaching them to move is to teach them to get to the point where they're gonna get to Mezzospada, so that way then they can press Mezzospada, and then you get your Mezzospada plays, of which there are 34. It's a tremendous amount of material, and it's all based off simple crossings. So, and then you get book four, which are more advanced defenses, in my
right.
opinion, right? Like especially with the sword and large buckler, those are more advanced defenses where you are learning how to, like what he says in his introduction when he says all of your parries should go forward and should be followed with a riposte. That's what I see in book four, right? You're learning how to take a defense and turn it into something that's kind of an oh shit thing, like what you see in book one with a lot of the counters, where a lot of your basic counters to a lot of the attacks are going into Guardia di Faccia or something like that. His typical oh shit counter, and then all of a sudden now you're learning how to progress from making a simple parry, taking that second attack and turning it into a counter attack. So
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm just going to add one more thing on there. Just coming back to that initial drill I told you we teach, right? And
yeah.
I'm gonna have to borrow from Fiore here because this is an area where terminology is the same, but application's got a shade of difference, right? So for Fiore, the largo ends at the half sword, but also is about an asymmetrical crossing at the half sword, right? Left foot forward to your right foot. The stretto starts at the half sword and goes in, but in its ideal form, we have parity in the bind. So I mentioned we have, this drill where I step in to stop an attack, I step away, I step back, or I break it. So in the same way, when you're teaching these one-step actions, like you said, Josh, it's not about the half sword, it's about trying to do something, and if it fails, you're in the half sword, right? So that first attack, stepping in, that we're teaching them a counter attack, slipping the left foot into the attack. But at the same time, we're also teaching them, or we're setting them up for, okay, they didn't die, or you didn't have time to make it an attack, it became a parry. Now you're in the crossing of Gioco Largo at the half sword.
Yeah.
The step away, same idea. Now you're in the crossing of Gioco Stretto at the half sword. And so, much then when we get to these actions with our students and we're ready to look at the half sword, they already understand a whole bunch of different ways to come to those crossings. They just haven't had a chance to dive down into what happens at that crossing. That becomes the next step.
Right.
And, I'm sure that any of these guys would have said, oh, yeah, absolutely. If he cuts at you and you can just step offline and hit him in the face, yay you. But it doesn't happen very often.
No.
And so now you're going to be in a bind, and now you have to understand the half sword.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of one of those things, right? Like you typically see those first, second, sometimes third intention actions land on people that might have less experience. But when you get into fighting experienced fencers, that's where you find yourself at the half sword crossings, and then the Gioco Stretta plays become a lot more imperative. It's actually interesting. I'm going to go on a tangent here for just a second and kind of take this off script, but I actually noticed something when I was. I got a question about one of my interpretations for Manciolino's book 4, his sword and large buckler, and the defense against the parry, and somebody had asked me why why I thought the beat that I was using for the fifth play would work. And my answer naturally came back to Fiore. And this is something where, again, I think, kind of looking at the overall scope of Italian martial arts is actually really beneficial. But the whole concept of instabile and stabile, the
Hmm.
fact that that person is extending forward with that thrust means that I can beat. And if I miss my beat and it doesn't go to the middle of their sword, if I don't strike the middle of their sword where you typically want to beat, especially if somebody's in a fixed position, if they're extending forward and they're in stabile, I can beat at their sword, and even if I miss the middle and I hit more towards their strong, it's still going to send their sword flying because their body structure is, you know, committed forward in that attack. And that was something that was super interesting, and I'm looking forward to continuing to apply that through my study of Bolognese fencing. But that was pretty trippy. Okay, so actually, this next one is
Yeah.
kind of big. You already kind of alluded to this a little bit. You gave us a nice natural segue that I sort of avoided by bringing us back into Maranzo. But how do you approach interpretation?
Sure. Um, so step one, it is not a divinely received script, and none of these guys thought it was either. Well, Narvaez probably thought it was, but he's kind of the, as Puck Curtis said, he is sort of stuck being the defender for the Satan of historical fencing. So, but for the rest of these guys, I don't think they thought it that way either. Um, I try to look at it a couple different ways. Number one, we are trying to recreate traditions, and what we're really trying to do is create modern branches of these traditions, right? We can't, no matter how faithful we are. And that doesn't mean I'm not saying we can't do Bolognese fencing. I think we can, but we have to understand that it's Bolognese fencing with a, who knows how many centuries gap, and that this is now a modern branch of that tree. It's not that tree. Um, so that's the first thing, is you just have to accept that, or you'll make yourself insane. Um, the second thing then is you have to figure out what's the context you're trying to use it for. Obviously, obviously there's a lot of different ways to approach this, and the HEMA community has grown big enough that a lot of different people take those different approaches. Some are very much traditionalists in that they are interested in the art as the art's sake. They are interested in the aesthetics of the art. They're interested in the material culture of the art, etc. Right? Um, there are some who take it even a step further, and if it's not in the book, they won't do it. I kind of call that the museum piece martial artist. They are trying to build a faithful reconstruction of what's in the book with, to my mind, the risk that you are building a replica of something and not the something. The flip side, of course, is the absolute just modern sports competitor who just wants to know, will this thing work when I'm at XYZ tournament, with my modern sword and my modern gear. And that is another component of the community as well. And obviously the problem there is that because you don't know what you don't know, and none of us have fought with sharp swords, um, you and I talked about this last time, Josh. You can overweight something that's happening in sparring for being real, and of course something that's in a judged match even more. And then there's most of us who are somewhere in between these continuums, right? Like,
Yeah.
I want to spar because I think that gives me a way to pressure test some ideas. I want to use competition to see what happens when I fight people I don't necessarily know and we're adrenalized. Um, I want to try to train this stuff as rigorously as I can. And more, there's a larger component of the community who get, like, if I don't really understand how the material culture and the intellectual culture around this stuff works, I'm not going to understand what a guy who's been in his grave for 500 years is trying to tell me. So, so I fall somewhere more on that end of things than I do on the other side of things. So my approach is this: this stuff isn't sacred, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. You have to be willing to look around the art you study. So you have to be able to look at, like, what came before it and what came after it, and what can that tell me where I can't answer a question. You also have to be able to look at what is contemporary on its fringes. So, in the Bolognese tradition, 16th century, Obviously, I don't see a problem with looking at Meyer or looking at a Godinho for comparison purposes. I don't mean you're just grafting, but I mean you're looking to see how they answer questions where you might be stuck. You're certainly far better off doing that than saying, oh, well, this Japanese sword art is also from the 16th century, right? Obviously, we don't have a connection there. But then you do at some point hit a like, how do monkeys with clubs work? And if you start seeing a commonality across cultures in time and place, you're foolish not to at least make note of that, because you have to at some point understand that you're trying to take written words and create physical actions. So you always start with the source and then you work outward. The further you get from the source, then the more reaffirmation I think you need for data points. In other words, if I'm trying to understand the mechanics of what someone's trying to explain about, I'm just going to make something up, cutting to close a line, right? And so that, here's the line from Vadi. When you cross resolutely. As you cross, push down a little so that your point stands to his face. Okay? It's a counterattack through a cut, is what it is, right? It's basically what the Germans would call Zornhaut or Fiore might call his first play of the first master of Largo. But so if I'm trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? Push down and stand my point to his face. So what am I going to do? I'm going to look at Fiore because he and Vadi are in the same tradition. If I'm still stuck, then maybe I'm going to look at 15th century German texts, and I'm going to look at the earlier Bolognese texts because one's closely related in place and is just a couple generations later. The other's closely related in time. And so I see, okay, so there's this Zornhau idea that has you cross and then extend in a thrust. We see similar things. It just doesn't have a specific technical name in the Bolognese tradition. So now I'm starting to see these recurring data points of this idea that you can parry a cut by cutting into it. And even if you don't hit them in time, your point's aligned for a thrust, as long as the whole idea has been redirecting your point. Now I have enough data points that I have a pretty good working theory for my interpretation. Understanding, I still might be wrong. And then the other thing, and I did a lecture series during Zoom about this, which is that, you have to have the right tools. You don't try to interpret Fiore with a 54-inch long fetter. It's the wrong sword, right? It's just the wrong sword. You have to understand, Charles, I'm really glad that Charles Lynn's been popularizing this, but the number of people who have been very, who've taken their shots at Roland Varzecka and his discussion on stepping and footwear, etc., all because maybe they put on a pair of leather-soled dress shoes once and tried defense in their saddle, but have never gone hiking wearing armor and leather shoes, or have never actually worn a doublet and seen how, from the 16th century, and seen how it literally changes your shoulder carriage because it has to, right? All those sorts of things. It doesn't mean you have to become a reenactor, but it does mean that you at least have to try to engage with people who have that knowledge to understand how those things affect what you're doing. And if your goal is to interpret and accurately, historically accurately. And the last thing is, and this is a big one, is that as you're doing all of this, you have to become at least functional enough with the language and the intellectual culture of the period to get when you're reading jargon and when you're just reading words, right?
Yeah.
Right. The word stretto is a real problem for English speakers because it means close, it means narrow, and it means constrained. And it means all of those things in English, in Italian. But in English, we have 3 separate words, all with shades of meaning. And we keep trying to force fit one of those onto this Italian word. But really, when my guard is in stretto, it's narrow. When my play is in stretto, it's close. And sometimes when I'm in the stretto, my play is also constrained.
Yep.
But all of those things can be true. And it's funny because, God forbid HEMA people in America discuss silver. But it's funny because how does he describe his fights, right? Wide play, close play. Guards are wide-spaced or narrow-spaced. And so I just bring that up because you see right there the equivalent to largo in both and the equivalent to stretto in both, but he uses two separate words. And so I think it's a reminder that, you know, we're moving across time and across languages and idiom changes. And no one got into this to be a linguist, but you're stuck being a linguist. So,
Yeah, there was a recent controversy about whether or not HEMA is dead, and HEMA killed it with a video that came out.
yo, is that's I think Russ's video, right? So,
Yeah, but I actually, to sort of build off of your point, my counterpoint to that is that I think that HEMA is more alive than it's ever been, for the purpose that we have more material now to find those data points. For 16th century authors in particular, when I look at over the last 5 or 6 years, we have Lavino, we have, two translations of Vigiani. We've got, three different Marazzo translations, one in full. We've got Marazzo's Dagger. We've got Marazzo's Sword and Small Buckler from Leone. We've got two different translations of Manciolino, and we've got the Anonimo Bolognese. And, outside of that, we've got the Riccardiano. We've got a bunch of other sources. And when I see all of that stuff start to come out, those are data points where, like, as a Bolognese practitioner, now I've got so much more data that I can go to without ever actually having to venture into, looking at KDF sources or looking at Meyer and the Freifechter sources, or even in some cases going back and looking at Fiore. Though I do, obviously, with the current run I'm on, I do think Fiore is important. But that said, I do feel like I can find all those answers looking at 16th century Italian sources.
you largely can. I mean, like I said, now and then you may not, especially when you're trying to
Sure.
figure out terminology. But that's exactly it. And so, as I said, you only jump to the next ring away from your source when you just slam into a brick wall, right? And you just can't get an answer. And then that's when you make that jump because you're trapped. But you're exactly right. I mean, Russ is a bit of a gadfly and always has been. That's kind of his jam, and that's fine. The whole is HEMA dead? HEMA's dead, whatever. I don't know because I don't even know what HEMA is. It's a catch term. It's a catch term we made up years ago on top of another as a subset of a catch term. Western martial arts. And in reality, it's like any other martial art. It's become big enough now that there are people doing HEMA-esque things for specific reasons. And if they're having a good time, I don't care. But like you said, the end result is that it's achieved enough critical mass that there's enough people doing things and enough that resources are made available that would never have been available. So yes, if your goal was everybody was going to be, these kind of hermetic priests perfectly reconstructing things in very deep erudite scholarship, then yes, I guess it's dead. If your goal was that there was any chance that all this work was going to survive into the next generation, then it's doing better than it ever has. And as Russ and I go back to the 90s, to the era of the manuscript grubbers with Steve Hick, it's a hell of a lot better situation than when there was like 20 of us on planet Earth exchanging photocopies and God help us microfiches. So I agree with you. I think the potentiality is better than ever.
The one thing I get concerned about is when I run across people who come out to fence or come out to play with us, is there's a diminished interest in the scholarship side to me, and a lot more people that just want to play sword tag.
That's 100% true. That's 100% true. And there's plenty of people who I actually meet who like don't even know that there's necessarily even books out there, or that if there are, they exist anywhere besides Wichtenauer, right? But you know what? That's true if you're talking about judo or aikido or kendo or sport fencing. That's the problem with a larger community. That's just the reality of it. I mean, I publish books in this stuff, right? Our sales are flat. They have been for years. So the community has grown, but everybody assumes that like we must be selling a bajillion books. No, but I'm going to give you the upside of that also, is that as a publisher, the downside is people no longer feel like they have to buy everything that comes out, right? The upside is that's because I only do 15th century German longsword. Well, there's enough things for you that all you need to do is buy, which goes back to Joshua's point that you could just say if it's not 16th century in Italian, I don't give two shits, and you could have a perfectly full shelf of works to pull off of. So I agree with you, Stephen, but I think it's the price we paid for being successful, and I don't. I think in my optimistic days, I think the overall price is probably to the good.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So how do you go about, now that we've kind of established how we develop the interpretations, how do you go about validating those interpretations?
Sure. Okay. Well, so first of all, it has to obviously it has to at least seem to fit what the source says, right? I mean that's just a given. But then the second thing is that, and this is where some really cool interpretations, go to the graveyard, and where I certainly have sent some of my own to the graveyard over the years to my great sorrow. So just because a play is really cool and seems to fit the text, if it requires you to do something that seems a complete and total oddball from the rest of the source, and there's no explanation of that, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like, why is it there? And so the guy who's the best for this as a source is Fabris. Because like Fabris explains why you should learn the sword alone and why you should not rely on hand parries, right? Totally shouldn't. They suck. Use the sword. But then he has chapter on hand parries, right? But then he proceeds to explain exactly why he's including them and why you need them, and how also by learning these you'll be getting ready to learn how to use the dagger. So he answers the question for you. Wait, if I wasn't supposed to hand parry, why am I hand parrying, right? But most of these guys don't do that sort of thing. So if you get a technique and you're doing this and you're like, well, that's really weird, I never do any kind of cross steps in this whole text. And here I'm doing this kind of crab walk cross step to make this work. And it really seems to work, but it's totally different. It appears nowhere, and he said nothing about it. Well, now before we even worry about does this really work in my full kit when someone tries to hit me in the skull hard, before we even get there, I have to ask myself, well, is there a way to make this work that doesn't require that?
Right.
And that's, I think that's where we all become our own worst enemies, because we get really married to interpretations, especially ones that seem really freaking cool. and then we'll sometimes be like, well, I put my gear on and it works. Well, sure, okay, it worked, but that still doesn't mean it's how, a Bolognese master would have done it, right? And so that has to get married. Those two things have to get married. Does it fit the overall movement aesthetic and tactics of the system, combined with, does it fit does it actually work when we really try to do it under pressure? And if it can't hit both of those, then you probably haven't quite gotten there yet. Obviously, complex techniques may take time before you can do them in free play. But if you can't even do it under just, we put all of our safety gear on, and I say, okay, Steven, blow my head off, right? And I can't make that work. Well, and even though I know the attack, I know what's coming, and I can't make it work, then maybe that tells us something.
Yeah, definitely.
But I think it has to be both of those things.
That's why one of the things I like is having heretical students that are always looking. They're super annoying to teach, but the ones that are always looking to try to prove you wrong when you're teaching something. Mm-hmm. I've been caught out on a few of those mistakes myself sometimes, and it always kind of emphasizes what you're saying, which is the importance of being simple, direct, and violent, essentially.
Right. Yeah, outliers require some sort of additional evidence to, to fit. So,
Yeah, that actually leads into our next question pretty well, because what do you do about gaps in play or progression? So a source not telling you to do what something, for example, like, a lot of times you'll be doing sword and dagger, and then next thing you know, you have like three sword actions with no mention of what you do with the dagger through the progression, or you might be doing sword and buckler, and you've got three actions with the sword, but nothing with the buckler, no mention of the buckler, nothing. You might even finish an entire play in some sources in Sword and
yeah.
Buckler without ever hearing any mention of the buckler. So what do you do about those?
Yeah, I'm gonna just mention this as a side note because I know that you've also dabbled with Lignitzer's Sword and Buckler plays.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Don't you wish everybody wrote them as clearly as those six simple little plays?
So
Like,
easy.
they're super simple. They're like an entire curriculum by themselves, and in his good little neurotic German way, he tells you every single thing to do with everything.
Yep.
Like, so simple, so not bolognese.
No.
Okay, so having put that aside, but actually part of the reason I played with those was specifically because we were getting so frustrated with some of the bolo stuff. Like, where did the F did the buckler go?
Right.
So this is my, how I learned to relax, how I relaxed and learned to love the missing buckler answer, which is that I think, for example, in the assaulty, where the buckler's often missing, it's often a floating piece of armor. We know that, right? It's just extended, closing a line. It's sometimes warding the hand. We know that. I think part of the problem when you're fighting double with small weapons, a rotella is a little bit simpler because it's a lot more a cloak because they're relatively static because of their size. Um, but I think with those smaller weapons, the problem is there's a lot of places they can go and do go, and there's a lot of variation possible. But when it has to go someplace, it has to do a specific thing, they tell you, right? You're cutting at me, and I'm going to. I mean, here's bread and butter bolognese play with every combination. You attack me, I cross line pass with the right foot, collect at the guard in guardia di faccia, right? Cut around with a reverso while making a pass at the left. Okay, bread and butter action. So with sword and buckler, I could just leave the buckler floating there. I could certainly, flip it over my hand, or I could marry it to the sword so that it's making the grip bigger. Usually they tell you specifically there to basically conjoin the hands in whatever phrase they choose in that moment. So it comes up over and over and over again. So, well, why? Well, because you're moving right into the line of attack, and there's always a chance, especially against a tall opponent, their blade overrides the top of yours. But if you put the buckler there, there's zero chance of that. And it doesn't matter what kind of hilt you have, your hand's protected. So I think because of the nature of the blow, it's important that the buckler and the sword work as an item together. So they call it out. Yet, as I do the cut around, am I punching him in the face with the buckler? Am I pressing his elbow with the buckler? Am I just holding the buckler up just in case? And I think the answer is you could do all of those things. So once you understand the action, you should do all three of those things. And so I think that's the tricky part fighting double, is that they only give us the things where I have to do something with the secondary arm, and then we have to just play through the variants.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I'm polishing up my techniques right now for the second half of book 1 chapter 1, or book 4 chapter 1 for Manciolino before we go and record those. And one of the plays that we've been looking at right now, one of the sort of loose interpretations that I put an asterisk to come back to was the fifth play, which is where you parry with your true edge and then you cut a reverso that prevents your opponent from ever cutting a mandrito at you. And it's a weird play because it's one of those things where you're doing this right foot step across, and if you end up beating to their sword comes right back at you, and you're always open to a double, even if you cut that reverso to their face. And from a martial perspective, that reverso to the face is never going to be something that's going to stop somebody cold in their tracks. I mean, you might slice across their face or something. And so I've been going through like all these different iterations, trying to like work through this play and make it work. You know, a beat also doesn't actually fit the Italian text because he doesn't use terminology that meets or fits with a beat.
Right.
It sounds like he's just making a true edge parry. And you know, I think my training partner and I today, we actually finally settled on something that was, you know, getting this true edge turn up underneath, almost in a Gordia de Entrare type position,
Mm-hmm.
and then getting it sets up this beautiful buckler press with that right foot step across that then you can get that slice in. If you don't get the buckler press, then what you end up kind of getting is an opportunity for a buckler punch, because if that means their arm is too low, and so you know you can basically just, you know, punch across with a buckler or something like that. And it's like you were saying, you know, you find yourself in these positions where you kind of find all the advantageous flow of the play, and you
Mm-hmm.
find where everything starts to fit, and then it's like, well, you know, Manciolino doesn't specifically tell me to go for a buckler press there, but if I've got the opportunity to get that buckler press on that outside arm, on the outside of his arm, pressing it into his body, of course I'm going to take it. You know,
Right.
Lignitzer, like you said, Lignitzer is like very explicit about like always going for those type of actions. And that's one of the things that I think Lignitzer really opened my eyes to developing my interpretations for, you know, a lot of Manciolino. And you know, some people might find that heretical, but you know, whatever.
I
But
kind of. Oh, go ahead.
he taught me how to use the buckler in a way that's offensive, right, and controlling. And that's the thing that I find is I'm getting these buckler presses, I'm getting these, you know, collapsing positions, and it makes it so much more uh, like active instead of reactive. I'm pressing my advantage on my opponent. So, what are you gonna say, Steven?
Oh, I was going to say that I think one of the hidden things that's actually instructions in something like Mancellino is the targeting information. I kind of got this when I was studying the Anonimo. If you think about it, if you're cutting on the outside and you're throwing a reversal on the outside, the face is not a particularly good target. So usually, I think, at least in the Anonimo, and I'm assuming in Mancellino as well, you would target the head, whereas when they give the face as a target, I really come to the conclusion that means it's from inside the bind and it's like a slice inside. So it'd be a reverso from an inside crossing. And so the target is actually giving you hidden information. That doesn't really play to what the buckler's doing, but if we work on the idea that the buckler is there to support the sword, then, which is, I don't think, a crazy idea.
No,
Then,
that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to play with that.
so that's what I started doing is, but
Yeah.
I'm old and fat and slow, so I kind of have to look for things to be really efficient.
Well, no, I mean it's interesting you bring that up, right? Because that's one of the sort of the very we came up with probably like 10 or 15 different variations on this play, trying to figure it out. Like I had one that I was going with as kind of my standard, but we were trying to really do it in a partnered way to break the play, right? Like that's one of the things that I think is important. Like what Greg highlighted is you need to try to break your plays. You need to be able to take them into like sparring or
Absolutely.
like action. And so we were really trying to break these plays in every way possible. And you know, one of the things that we had was an inside sort of parry and then kind of slice. So that's pretty interesting. I'm gonna pay attention to that now.
Should we move on to the next one here?
Yeah. We can go. So, all right. So overall, you know, one of the keys to developing interpretations is having translations. But what constitutes a good translation?
Wow, you really want to make people hate me, don't you? Man,
Clearly, it's
man.
word for
Every
word as close as you can.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The literal
The
translation
literal
is
translation.
the absolute best and most important thing you should
Ideally, with a
have.
drop-down menu, so you can include every possible
Yes,
definition of that word. So
And
we
you
should
should
start putting them in
also
books.
if you're translating Italian, ignore every single source or bit of scholarship besides Florio's First Fruits,
Yes.
because it's from the 16th century and therefore is decidedly received from the hand of God himself. Um, so yeah, okay. So Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, um, there's a lot of ways to do bad translation, and uh, and I think in our last interview, Josh, I said that the one thing that Germans, Italians, and Spaniards didn't need the HEMA community to do was teach them how to speak their own language. And so I'm going to add to that. The other thing that the world didn't need was the HEMA community to teach people how translation works. Especially in a community mostly driven by engineers and computer programmers, it seems. It's really, these skills have existed for a long time. So the very first thing, literally, is just take the entire idea of a literal translation and throw it out the window. And don't, for 1 minute, tell yourself that by being more literal, you've got a better translation. That is the answer for people who don't actually speak the language they're translating into. It just is. And, my speaking Italian's pretty shitty. My reading Italian's okay. My speaking Italian's pretty shitty unless I spend a lot of time over there. But even so, why is it pretty shitty? Because we conceptualize in English differently than we do in Italian. And when you're not really being fluent in your head and you have to think about that, you start speaking the other language with its words but your grammar. And and we hear immigrants to the United States do that in English all the time. And there's a whole bunch of people who like to take pot shots at immigrants for that, to which my thought has always been, you go speak another language then, see how you do. But this isn't about politics. This is, I guess it's politics of translation, right? Is that to that end, that's exactly the problem. You have to take a language that has its own grammar and its own idiom and its own context, and you have to move it into not just English but into fluent modern English. So if the English result at the end doesn't read like your mother tongue, the way someone in your mother tongue would write, it's not a good translation. So that's just the first thing. Clunky does not mean good. I don't care how literal it is. The second thing is, you have to identify what is and isn't jargon to the best of your ability. I think I've told you about this one before, but it's worth revisiting because it's a great way to explain the difference between Bolo and Armazzari and how a little knowledge of both could get you into big trouble. So a horizontal cut in the Bolognese tradition is a tondo, right?
Right.
The word just means around. To go around the world is tondo il mondo, right? Okay. So there's one passage in Fiori in the equestrian section where it basically is literally the equivalent of what I described earlier about the collection in Guardia di Faccia, right? But we're passing each other on horses. So our swords meet mandrito to mandrito. I hook my pommel over your blade and I cut around to the back of your horse or your head as I pass on my horse. And so he says cut around to the back of the head, tondo. But in the early 2000s, people made themselves insane trying to figure out why all of a sudden, aside from his segno, Fiori has this term for cutting horizontally when we all thought that was mezzana. So maybe a mezzano isn't a half cut, or maybe it's not a middle blow, maybe it's a half cut. So it's just the same two fendente lines, but just when you stop halfway, that's a mezzano. Now, all of that ignored that he literally then illustrates the damn thing and calls it a mezzano. But they're like, no, you see, those are the arrows pointing. That's the arrows pointing to see, stop halfway. And so my point here isn't to take a shot at anybody. It's to just say that, we wasted a lot of digital ink and a lot of Alka-Seltzer on something because we took something that is both a piece of jargon and just a descriptor in one art and made it jargon in the other art, right?
Yeah.
And so that isn't even saying is a Bolognese mezzovolta the same as Fiori's mezzovolta. This is literally taking a piece of jargon from one art and trying to make a jargon in an art that's unrelated. So that's why, you have to understand that. And just because a tondo is indeed the name for a cut, it didn't stop making the word mean around. And there are perfectly good times where a Bolognese master will just say, step around. He didn't suddenly sneak an extra cut in. He's just trying, So you have to look for those constructs. Make a tondo, where it becomes obvious. And so that's the thing. Stephen, I forget. I don't think the Anonymous is bad about this like Marozzo is, but Marozzo tries to stick every single descriptor in front of the word cut he possibly can.
Yes.
I love it,
Pull, tear, rip, saw, and he just means cut. But that was another thing. We spent ages trying to figure out what all these different kinds of cuts were and why does he need to define them? Well, because there's nothing to define. So that's part of a good translation too, is understanding what is the jargon you're looking at and then coming up with a consistent way to translate it.
Yeah.
And like I said, sometimes that means that it has to be consistent for your language. And that was why I brought up stretto earlier, right? If I was just translating the word stretto and I was doing a text on Bolognese, I don't tend to translate the guard names. I think the technical jargon should stay in the original language. That's me. Not everyone does that. But if I was translating it, I would say the narrow iron gate or the narrow long tail, close, but I would say close play.
Yeah.
Okay. And elsewhere I might say, when you constrain his sword, right? So whereas other times I would, translate one term the same over and over and over again.
Like tempo, right?
Like tempo, right.
in the fencing manuals can mean, like 30 different things, but if you're translating it, you have to try to figure out in that context, what does he mean by tempo?
Right.
Which can just
exactly.
mean now, but it could also mean in the motion of, it could mean in the moment when something happens, all kinds of crazy stuff.
Right, and the simple fact that a dictionary says time doesn't actually tell you anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, and sometimes the authors are really good about calling out their own jargon, right? Like with Manciolino at the start of I think it's book 3, he basically gives you a translator's note on, hey, this is the jargon that I'm using, talking about like feet and how he describes feet and stuff like that. I think the Anonymous is pretty good about that too, Stephen. And you can speak to that in terms of, in his introduction, he gives you a really good explanation of a lot of the things that he's going to use that are jargon. Whereas Marozzo just comes up with all of his random jargon and gives you no definition of what his jargon is, but he makes up things that exist nowhere else in the entire Bolognese system. So
yeah, and you also have to accept that he also isn't consistent in how he describes actions. So, sometimes you are stepping to your right and sometimes you're stepping, to his right, right? You don't always he flips how he describes those things. So, there isn't a simple passage. Marozzo can't find a way to complicate needlessly.
He's pretty awful. Although he is way better than Altoni, that's for sure.
No one could ever pay me enough to translate that text.
I just answered one of that questions for you,
Jeff. Yeah, you sure did. I just thought I would just jump right there to you.
Yeah, I thought I would
somebody really should, and it should be somebody who's really fluent in Italian.
Yeah.
So, because you know what, Stephen, you and I are a little long in the tooth. There's just not enough years left to put ourselves through that.
It's a 20-year project to do Altoni. Yeah, I think I tried one paragraph of him and was like, oh, forget this, dude. This guy's awful.
You guys are
just to learn Florentine fencing, it's not that important.
You're breaking my heart. Listen, I mean, but the ultimate counter to Fabris is the Riccardiano, right? Because you were just talking about how Fabris tells you to always parry with your sword, and the Riccardiano talks about how only bad fencers parry with their swords, and you should always parry with your hand, and these are the things that you should do when your opponent makes the mistake of parrying with their sword.
Right. On the other hand, the Anonimo Riccardiano is Anonimo probably for a reason.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Don't go too far there. We could say that about the Anonymous Bolognese too. So.
Oh, that was Manciolino's first draft.
So, yeah.
Before he parsed it down into the necessary material.
No, I always wondered about Fabris too. If he knew so much, why did he have to go live in Denmark to make a living?
Because it was a really well-paying gig. It's not like being Saviolo in England.
I don't know. Are you sure?
Yeah,
Because as soon as he
I'm pretty
could,
sure.
he wanted to get away from there. He's like, "Please let me return to Padua,
Yeah,
please,
look
please."
up the bio of his patron
Yeah. Okay. All
sometime
right.
of Christian.
Oh,
Yeah.
I have a little bit. Yeah.
Besides being a hell rake, he also was that was a good gig, and and let's remember that put the bleeding stake through the heart of the German tradition.
There is that.
So yeah,
The
Yeah,
guy
'cause
from Modena, though, who's the guy from Modena? I forget his name. Anyway, he did the good thing, which is he got somebody to translate his work into English, and didn't even have to move to England to do it.
oh,
He was just
Degrassi, yeah, yeah,
That is the ultimate boss move.
yeah,
He gets to
Yeah.
stay in Venice doing what he wants to do, eating Italian food, and still sell books in England.
yeah.
Yeah. So is that like the ultimate purgatory for an Italian fencer? Is England?
Pretty much.
Yeah, there's
Is that
a
why-
just,
Hell
the
is
good-
hell is Ireland, but
Yeah.
purgatory's England.
I read a description by this Italian chef, basically calling England a miserable, like terrible little island. Basically describing to them how to make a salad because they didn't know how to make salads either.
Yeah, I always think about poor Hawkwood's widow, who after the Florentines totally reneged, on the pension they promised her, ended up having to move to his family's home in England, being a Florentine woman raised in Tuscany, and then there you are in northern England, like. You are really wondering why God hates you. So,
Not to rip on our friends in England.
not at
It's
all.
Just cold and gray and rainy. That's all.
I love right as well. As my friend Mark Lancaster from the Exiles puts it, the weather forecast is drab with a chance of drabber. Yeah.
So how should we approach existing translations? What are some things that people can look at to say this is a good translation, this is a bad translation?
Does it read like your mother tongue? Step one. If you're struggling to just comprehend the language because it's too clunky, it's a bad translation. That's just the first thing. The second thing, assuming you don't have someone who's actually truly fluent in both languages to look at it and say, oh, this is a good translation, is can it achieve what it needs to do, which is are you able to actually read it as a physical instructional work and follow it coherently? And that means certain things that would not be in the original, like does it have punctuation that actually allows a modern reader to read?
Dude,
Right?
seriously, right?
Does it have punctuation?
Oh, God.
So,
So-
because if it doesn't, that's not how we read things, right? A great example of this too is, and people lost their minds when he did this. Tom Leone's Faber's translation is in the present tense. Like every 17th century book ever, it's in the future. It's in the future conditional in the original.
Yeah.
We don't use the future conditional in English for anything anymore. We did in the 17th century, but his goal wasn't to create a 17th century English translation. It was to create a 20th century translation at that time, 21st now. I guess 21st. It all blurs after a while. But so instead of, if you were to find him in this guard, you would then do blah. If he is in prima, you will take a quarta. See the difference? One of those is much easier to read and in no way changes anything about the text instructions. And it's how a modern person reads it. The other one is literal and is grammatically correct, but is not how anybody actually reads, and it's not what the original author was trying to achieve. So it's not a useful, there's no benefit to doing that. The other one is, there's an old Capoferro translation out there now where they didn't just not translate the jargon, they left it all conjugated. So, so Stephen just got that. So imagine how many different ways the word stringere appears?
Yeah.
It's a verb.
Yeah.
So, right?
And every
So,
Italian verb has about 70 different forms.
it sure feels that way, doesn't it? So imagine that. And and then you get into the part that a lot of those conjugations require a helping verb, but they didn't not translate that. So, I mean, I can't read it. I have to keep flipping back to, look at like, what the hell are they saying? So again, that's not useful. Um, you haven't, now you're not faithful to either language. So, so those sorts of things, if you're not going to translate jargon, you need to, you need to be consistent in the Italian form you put it in.
So I was going to
Um,
say, oh, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you.
no, no, go ahead. I was just going to say, unfortunately, we have a language, English, which is really good at stealing foreign words, right?
Oh, yeah.
So,
It's fantastic. I was going to say that when I was doing my translation, and I think what helped me the most is I tried to imagine reading it after 3 shots of Jack. And then I would keep polishing my translation until I thought, yeah, if I had 3 shots of Jack, I could still read this and understand it and not be tired.
I kind of like that, actually.
Yeah.
I kind of like that. So, but I mean, it is funny. Like in the class, our rapier instructor will say, make a cav when he means a cavazione, right? or one of my other students will say,
That's taking it a little
when
too
he's
far.
cavazioneing, and we were laughing about it. The first time she said it, we all laughed. And then we're like, that is like the most English language thing ever.
Ever. Yes, it is.
And like when they're cavazioning, and I'm like, and I can totally see like some 17th century English writer doing that. So so anyway, so obviously you don't want to become that formal with it, or that informal with it, but you want to just find a way to wield the jargon effectively without just creating a barrier to entry. Um, and that also means if you're working with multiple texts, say you're trying to create something where you're quoting from something, um, for God's sake, make some decisions about consistency. So one of my pet peeves is, uh, as you know, the Bolognese can't settle upon names for their guards. They all want to tweak them a little bit, right? And the Anonimo, who bless him, gave us Codolonga e Longa. Um, uh, Also just randomly sometimes drops the e's in between, right? It's just Codolonga Longa. And,
Yeah, that's what it is. Coda Lunga Lunga, yeah.
yeah, right. But then the other ones always would stick the a in there, that
Right.
e in between.
You
So
guys
it's like
don't Tonga Tonga?
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's like if you're gonna do one of these things, like pick one, right? Like if you're gonna quote from all these guys, don't make it even more confusing by sometimes calling it Coda Longa Estrada or Coda and then Coda Longa Stretta. And or don't make it Squalembrato with a G and then switch it to Squalembrato with a Q. You're not helping. You're not helping. Fiore spells Gengiaro 4 different ways in his manuscript. In our translation, we picked one. So those sound like simple, silly little things, but you'd be amazed at how people get lost in thinking that somehow they're lying to their reader. And you're not lying. You're interpreting, but that's because every translation is an interpretation.
All right, so kind of moving on from translation. Now we have to get into, I guess, the forefront of the HEMA discussion, which is, and this is going to sound like a stupid question, what's the importance of history in Western martial arts or in historical European martial arts?
Giving me all the lob balls today. Okay. Well, I know I said this in our last interview. You have a choice between doing HEMA, historical European martial arts, and modern European sword sport, or MES. So,
Oh, good.
so that's really the choice between us, before us. And and if you want to do mess, then you can be messy, and that's cool. Just know that that's what you're doing. There's a lot of mess out there. There's also a fair bit of HEMA out there. I think that's the point that Russ was trying to make in that video, by the way. But But the fact that that acronym just happened to come to me one day really comes to people have spent years now making fun of the white boy samurai and the crazy stories about katanas cutting off gun barrels in World War II and all this stuff. Um, but we're not immune to that. We're not immune to that at all. And I hear just ludicrous things being said about the historical context of these arts um, often when I read interviews with other practitioners, hear people talking. Look, medieval historians routinely say some really boneheaded things about arms and armor because the way we teach history is very Manichaean, where why would you ever look at the physical artifact, right? And newer generations of scholars are kind of changing that, but it's still very true. Leave that for the archaeologists. And so, but it works the other way around. So, there's a great book on 14th century warfare, and it is a really good book on infantry warfare. But people are quick to jump on the author, who is a very well-known academic of late medieval warfare, for talking about 8-pound swords and misdating armor in there. And I agree. Really, I mean, I agree in that if this is your specialty, you should probably be better at that. But by the same token, um, the idea that like people are wandering through the Italian streets in 1520 bristling with weapons, constantly cutting each other down in impromptu street fights, is crazy. I mean, someone did that. Giovanni de Medici did that at 13, and he got exiled, and his last name was Medici. So it's so those sorts of things I think really matter, and I really think that if you aren't going to um, if you aren't going to do that, you run into some real problems. I, when I tell people that the fencing terminology in the Bolognese text, the idea of an agent and a patient, comes out of the duel, who initiates the duel versus who was the defender, and it all has to do with legal terminology. They stare at me blankly, um, but but that's explaining to you why they're picking the terms they are. It's explaining to you why a guy like George Silver, who has nothing good to say about the Italians, is using the exact same terms, right? When we talk about time or tempo, etc., and you've got Vigiani quoting Aristotle, um, and we still have people saying, well, but maybe by 1550 they've changed that in this area because that doesn't fit my interpretation. even even though Newton comes along and changes things, in England, Aristotle was still the basis for the understanding of physics until the 1730s. In most of Europe, it was until the 1760s. So those sorts of things are important because without it, you are losing the context of what you're reading. And it does matter. It does matter.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. One of the episodes that Stephen and I are gonna do is just on the history of Bologna, and I found this really interesting paper that was written, and somebody went back and the Bologna. I'm going to throw out some spoilers here, but the University of Bologna actually had a scholarship program, and it was basically a doctorate program for people who were not wealthy, didn't come from a wealthy family, but were highly qualified. And the University of Bologna would bring them in for a doctorate program, and then they would teach at the university. And all of their dissertations were recorded, and so there's actually a good record. Whereas, and it was a public dissertation, so there's a lot of record around what these dissertations were about. There are copies of the dissertation that are widely available. And it's super fascinating to read through the things that these people were arguing, because some of them seem, very state of the art. But one of the things that was actually mentioned in this, and the reason I brought it up, is because when they're talking about physics, they're still arguing Aristotle's physics all the way through, up through like 1570 at the University of Bologna. in a lot of these
Right.
dissertations. That was something that I had noticed, so that kind of builds on
Right.
your point.
Right. Even though, Plato has been rediscovered, etc. Um, and so, yeah, and so it's important to understand that. It's important to understand that when they are talking about Germans and Italians and Spaniards, they are using those terms in a different way than we do. They are talking about really linguistic spheres of influence. They're not talking about nations in any way, shape, or form, and that changes things.
So wait, was Fiore a German or an Italian?
Depends on which side of the Alps you're on and who you're talking to. Um, Fiore would tell you he was a Furlong.
Right, yeah.
So,
He would tell you what city he was from, yeah.
yeah, and well, and his native language wasn't even Italian. It was Furlan, which is to this day a separate Romance language. It is related to Italian the way, say, for example, Galician or Catalan is related to Spanish. So it's
Interesting.
not a dialect; it's its own language. So
Well, we kind of get that in the Northern Italian sphere too, right? Like the Lombard language, which is much closer to modern Italian, and why some of the Bolognese authors are actually easy to plug into Google Translate for some people. Whereas, if you were to take like a Venetian, you're not going to get.
Oh, the Venetians. I'm not even sure the Venetians are really Italian. Studying it, they almost seem like a separate country.
well, I was going to say the
It's like,
Venetians spent most of their history not wanting to be part of Italy.
yeah,
And their solution during the Italian Wars was basically to say, okay, you guys do you. We're
Yeah.
going to go focus on the Adriatic
Yeah.
and build a naval empire. So,
yeah.
which, as it all turned out, might have been the right play. So,
The only way to win was not to play.
yeah, but yeah, it's so my point is that all of that is it's really important to understand the context. You know, it's and without that, my favorite one still remains the armored combat play everyone makes fun of, which is the guy unscrewing the pommel in Gladiatoria. Right? Like what are you going to do with this thing? You're going to hit a guy in 15th century plate armor in the head with a pommel. Until you remember that the dueling code is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and it says that it has to be done with the accuser throwing a weapon. So he's sure not going to throw his spear, the best weapon in armored combat, against this guy, and then have to go against him with a sword. And honestly, if the sword is welded together, like some of these judicial swords were, he's not going to, throw that away either. So why not just have an unscrewable pommel, throws it, he's filled the rules of the duel, and now here he goes. It's cheesy as hell. He's gaming the rules. But that's a great little point to understand. He's gaming the rules and showing you how to do it. So,
Yep.
but so all of that requires you to have some context of what you're reading.
Yeah, I agree. So, what do you think? How do you think that plays into the importance of developing interpretations? I mean, how does that kind of relate back to kind of our earlier discussion of like, do you think the history matters in developing interpretation?
Yes, yes, and I think the reason for that um, is really simple. Some of these, I mean, doesn't necessarily do much to make you understand how to throw a Mondrito Squalembrato. No, probably not. But does it make you try to understand the context of, for example, when Moreto is describing the difference between playing in Gioco Largo and Gioco Stretto? Or does it make you understand? Here's a great one that I think we're still all sorting out. The flourishes that occur between the main pieces of the Assalti, right? What are these guys doing here? Well, they're partly showing off, right?
They're swashing the buckler.
They're swashing the buckler, but why? Because martial display is important as well, right? And they're doing it in a way in which they're still moving through the guards, they're showing their prowess. They're kind of resetting into a new part of the form. The form usually kind of changes in character a little bit after that. But part of it is also a cultural thing. And so it does matter because it also tells you how you should be handling this. There's that great line, it's in the Anonymous, if I recall right. Stephen will correct me if I'm wrong, where he talks about when you come onto the field, you shouldn't look like you're coming from a house of dance, but from the house of a master of war, right? I mean, he's describing character to you. I think it's La Palestra, which has a similar thing that says that, that your eyes should burn, your eyes should burn like a demon's. And, he's talking about wrestling in this case. But he's giving you all these ideas of their character and how you should behave and how you should think. And, without having some idea of what this is a masculine art, right? What their notions of masculinity and martiality was, you don't, you're going to move, behave, and act like a 21st century person because that's what you are. So,
Yeah, I think one of the things we've talked about before is that the absence of dance, now that we mention it, is I think maybe one of the biggest stumbling blocks into people learning to do these things correctly. Because I think the important thing it's not that you actually want to dance when you're sword fighting, but you want the balance and you basically really want the buffed legs that comes from doing jumping types of dances like all the time.
yeah, I would honestly say, like, what are the two things that have evaporated from our culture that these guys would have had? And for all of the other folks who are not guys listening on the thing, obviously, we're talking about their 16th century counterpart. Is that men danced,
Right.
and men danced in a very formal sort of way, and men wrestled.
Right.
Now, wrestling stayed a core part of our culture until very, very recently.
Very recently.
Very recently. That is
Yeah.
something really lost in the in the
Last
latter
10
part of
years.
the.
Yeah.
Yeah, and declining steadily. Certainly, boxing started to decline in the second half of the 20th century,
Yeah.
and then wrestling became progressively more just usually ground wrestling as opposed to stand-up wrestling.
Right.
Folk wrestling kind of has become more and more outside what kids just do. But you take those three things, and those activities are just assumed by Castiglione to be foundational skills of a courtier. Like, no courtier doesn't know how to do that. And so, of course, no courtier doesn't know how to fence. But all of those things are part of one aesthetic skill set. And that's the hardest thing, I think, for us to understand how to recapture. Is, if you're really trying to do this historically, it's not enough to be able to hit someone with like a sword. You have to move like someone from this martial art would move with a sword. And that's informative. So those are the things that are missing, and we just have to understand that we are missing certain vital skills that, Marozzo assumed that that bumbling guy he didn't want to let loose with the general population of students already knew when he showed up. So
what are some examples of history, like, specifically influencing your interpretations? Like, are there any, like, that kind of like jump out to you from your memory that where you were like, wow, if I didn't understand the historical context for this, I would have never gotten it?
Oh boy. Oh boy. Sure. I'm gonna say this, and I refuse to take any comments online over it. The universality of what I generally now call moving in good order, but which Silver would call true times. Once you understand that that entire passage is a requote of Occam, who is the principal commentator on Aristotle from the 14th century on, who was writing, though being an Englishman, was writing at the court of the Emperor Rudolph, and was the single most translated authority on the idea of the physics in all of Europe from the 14th century until the early 18th. You begin to realize that, yeah, there is a way that any educated person in Europe conceptualizes movement, distance, and time. And once you see that, you start to see it every place. So that would be one. That's obviously one that shouldn't be controversial, but it is, for reasons.
Can I,
So,
because of that controversy, can I tell
yeah,
you something funny? We're gonna
yeah.
we have this HEMA parody, or I guess like textual source parody that we're gonna start filming pretty soon, and I'm just gonna go ahead and spoil one of them because it's too good, and I think you're gonna get a kick out of this. But we're gonna have George Silver sitting down at an Italian restaurant and telling the waiter how bullshit their menu is, because the bread should never be served before the appetizer, because you get too full on the bread and then you're not actually hungry for the dinner. So you should actually have your appetizer before your bread, because then you enjoy the appetizer and you're not full from eating the bread, and then you can enjoy your dinner, because then you're not going to eat as much bread.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. So look forward
That's
to
brilliant. That's brilliant. Yeah. So that's one. So that's probably like the one that'd be easiest for listeners to totally get. But there are certainly other ones. A lot of the ideas about the armored combat material in the 15th century sources only make sense once you understand something about judicial laws and judicial duels. And so when you're interpreting that, you have to realize that, like, you're like, God, in all these manuscripts, like, the guys are holding the swords in both hands. And now and then they're half swording, but like one for like every 20 images. But they're always holding the blade here. Well, yeah, because they're fighting in single combat in a controlled format. And while you and I are dueling, no one's coming up alongside of me and hitting me in the base of the skull with a halberd. So,
Right.
like, we can do that. That becomes another thing. The lack of what we would call boxing in 15th, 16th century grappling, right?
Right.
Its striking measure is all contained in dagger defenses.
Yeah.
And you think, why? I mean, certainly a drunk dude can throw a punch. Sure, but he's also armed. And punching is totally useless when we're wearing armor. So if we wrestle, we're coming to body wrestling unless there's weapons. And so those sorts of things all start to matter when you think about that. Why is it reverse grip? Why don't the daggers cut? Why does our dagger material look so different than a lot of modern knife stuff, which tends to today be drawn largely from Filipino martial arts, which is a tradition using cutting blades in a place very hot where people are wearing very little clothing.
So what do you think about the sort of the rise of the Randian? I'm going to call it Randian. It's not actually Randian, but the Randian perspective of sort of the trickle down hemonomics. I'm going to call it that. So let me explain that. So
Oh, I think I see where this is going, but okay, go ahead.
that we have to understand armor fencing to understand something like the Bolognese arts, or so on and so forth. Like, you have to understand armored fencing to understand unarmored arts. So it's kind of top down, right? Like, top would be like, this is
Yep.
this is what you would see as the pinnacle of warfare. So this is what would actually inform the techniques below it.
So I guess it's ironic if I'm going to support something Randian, considering my own personal real world political views. So I'm gonna hedge that a bit, okay?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
here's what I'm gonna say. It depends on what arts we're talking about. I mean, this is a Bolognese podcast, so if we were talking about 15th century German fencing or armazari, I would say that honestly, you cannot understand it without studying armored combat. Like, literally impossible. And a lot of the weird, bouncy, jumpy, sporty footwork we see, etc., would go away just by putting somebody in a harness and watching them try to do that.
Yeah.
And also just that you don't really understand the martial context without understanding that, and that's why it's the knightly art. Someone like Meyer certainly wants to partake of that argument, but then only sort of dabbles and touches on armor. And he, in that sense, is like the Bolognese masters. So here's what I would say. I would say that back in the day when I started doing this, everybody looked at Bolognese fencing as being kind of proto-rapier fencing. It's this unarmored dueling tradition, single combat, blah, blah, blah. And that's because most of the people researching it were coming to this from having done rapier fencing, especially here in the U.S., where most of them were coming
Yeah.
out of the SCA.
Yep.
Okay. So that was, Bill Wilson and people of his era, Patry. That was how they were looking at it, and that made sense, right? And they were really just kind of riffing on the way that guys like, that Castle, who I actually have a lot more regard for than a lot of modern people, and Jelly, and all those people were too. Um, Funny thing though is that even back in the early 20th century, guys like Novati in I just got done translating his intro, and where he does a pretty extensive and pretty good comparison of Fiore de Morozzo, and makes the point that, this is a military art. These were military arts. These guys clearly felt that they were training people for dueling for sure, but also for skills that would serve them in battle.
Yep.
But having said that, the Bolognese don't really emphasize mounted combat. I know that Delagochier's got a jousting section, but that's its own beast by that period anyway. They don't really emphasize that. They don't emphasize armored combat as a separate art. Obviously, if you're fighting with pole arms and you don't have some kind of armor on, life has done you dirty. Um, but they are talking about judicial dueling, and we do know that even in this period, the assumption was that anybody of any kind of quality fought judicial duels in some degree of armor. It's why Moncellino gives you advice about what kind of armor to pick.
Yep.
We know that people like Pazzo in the century before had referred to fighting unarmored in the lists as pimp fighting. So isn't that great? Which by the way gives you a whole new take on Fiore's 5 unarmored duels, right?
Yeah.
Right? And it tells you they're illicit as F, right? So do I think that means that if I want to start with Bolognese fencing, first thing I should do is buy a 16th century half harness? No, I don't. But I do think that people would understand more about things like sword and rotella, sword and buckler, even the pole arms, the imbracciatura, by having experience in at least partial armor, at least the armor that a Bolognese gentleman serving, in as a foot soldier, or the average Condotti arrow would be expected to own. A mail shirt or a breastplate, greaves, a helmet, gauntlets, something like that. So I do think that in these earlier arts, if you really want to study the whole art, you have to study the sword, you have to study pole arms, you have to study some close quarter combat, and you have to at least get some experience moving in armor or working with those who have. So yes, I guess that's my Randian take on it. So.
I'm sorry I put it in those terms, but I was just thinking, trickle down economics, so trickle down HEMA, and
no, I get it, and but, and it's funny because when I've had this conversation, people have said, well, that is really elitist, and I'm like, you're studying the martial arts of the military warrior aristocracy in some cases, or the really wealthy townsman class, who very much do not associate with the farmers in the fields. So,
well, and that's, I think that's a lot of the stuff that Stephen and I have also found in our research. We've, the elite mountain troops of Bologna were, that was, or Brissagallia. Like you've got some civilian forces that would have been less armored. That these techniques
like
would have
unarmored.
yeah.
Like broke-ass guys who own 2 sheep.
That these techniques would have been really beneficial to, and it seems like that's kind of what this was geared to in a lot of ways. But then you also have elites that are trying to formulate these ideas, and Stephen's got a really great theory on this that he can speak to, and I'll let him do that. But it kind of feels like that's where the Bolognese have a divide. But at the same time, you look at comments from like Manciolino where he tells you to keep your steps even and make sure that you have even stepping as you're approaching your opponent. Like that, to me, that makes more sense having context in armor. right? Like he still is thinking about that more upright posture, where like I think of exaggerated postures like Fabris or even Capoferro going either forward or backwards that never would exist in armor. Like you could not do that in a battlefield setting, you know, and the Anonymous talks about that too, being able to step in a way where you could step on, you know, you could walk in the grass or you could walk on, you
Right,
know,
it's like first rule of martial arts: don't fall down.
exactly, right.
Right.
But those are definitely even more, everything that you do, from my experience in armor, everything that might make you slip when you're doing it unarmored is going to put you flat on your face, right?
Right.
Hands down. Like you were just talking about shoes, right? Like I mean, even the shoes become that consideration. So, but without going too far off in that tangent, Stephen, why don't you speak to the sort of the evolution of Bolognese arms?
Yeah, so, well, I don't know if I'd say the whole evolution, but the part that we're looking at right now, which is early 1500s, late 1490s, the idea that my theory that I'm kind of playing with right now is that these arts are taught to like officers. And the reason why there's such a split between, or they spend so much time teaching the theory of weapons and then the practice of weapons, is to first show them how to fight, but also give them the theory so they can then basically pass that information off to either infantry volunteers, militia companies, or militiamen, or whoever they need to. Because the economics of it looks like, as we see from Marozzo, we get a sense of his prices, and those are like annual wages for a craftsman. So that's not just an average person learning that sort of thing. That's definitely an elite.
Exactly. Yeah,
But
the cheesemaker's not going to Marozzo to learn how to
Right.
use the two-handed sword.
But it's not necessarily super expensive either. It's not the Rangonis and the, Meroscatis who could afford to pay more for a private lesson. It's kind of your bourgeoisie, essentially. And so it's kind of, so the bourgeoisie can then teach the craftsmen how to use a spear when they need to put an army into the field.
Right. Well, and I think that's why a guy like Fiore, or a guy like Paulus Cal for that matter, right, who's working for a duke, or Fiore who's working for a marquis, and before that a number of fairly significant Condottieri commanders make a point. He makes a point that he's been well paid, right?
Right.
A lot of most fencing masters are moonlighting.
Yeah.
A Barozzo getting to be a fencing master. I've always wondered if part of the reason Moncellino wasn't obliquely taking a piss at him in his book about putting his prices up on a wall is he wasn't just flat out jealous. It's like, really? You get to have a school and I'm like, and I'm working part-time as a scribe or whatever, right? But, Vadi was likely a physician. I mean, most of these guys fencing, and this didn't change. Through the whole early modern period, we see that soldiers, and this is, of course, the birth of this military revolution, soldiers learn some very basic skills. And then if they want to learn more, they have to go hire a fencing master to learn it.
Right.
And that's true, in the Napoleonic era, that's true. Here's 3 parries and 4 cuts and go get 'em, kid. And in this case, it was probably more like, here's how you hold a pike.
Yeah, pretty much. Here's how you march with a pike. Stand here, stab.
Right.
Yeah.
And then if you're of if you have of greater means where you're expected to either pay for cavalrymen or be a cavalryman, that means you're also expected to know what to do with that. So, yeah, I think that's important to understand is that, would Joe Schlub, or I guess in this case Giuseppe Schlabati, would Giuseppe Schlabati be an expert in the Bolognese school? No, I doubt it. Whatever training he had would probably look like, honestly, it'd probably look a lot like Fiore's sword in one hand lesson, right? Here's a universal parry. Yep. Here's a couple of grapples, and by the way, probably followed with that. Here's how when your sword's up high, you throw it back the other way in case you missed. And hey,
do that 1,000 times, kid.
Yeah,
you're ready to fight.
Yeah, well, and I published an essay on this a long time ago. I think it's on the Freelance blog, where it's funny because the Chinese in World War II put together this Dao regiment, like this two-handed falchion regiment to deal with the Japanese coming and to deal with bayonets. And they basically, because they didn't have enough guns. So what they
Wow.
basically taught them was the exact same universal parry.
Wow.
Awesome.
Hold the thing low on your right, cut up to knock it aside, cut back down, wash, rinse, repeat. So, yeah, it's. I'm sure they were taught there are three blows. There's a mandrito, a reverso, and a thrust.
Yeah.
So since
So,
we're on the topic of peasants and learning to fight, I'd like to bring up one of my favorite condottieri, who has, I think, the coolest name of any condottieri, which is Melchiorre Ramazzotto. It just sounds like somebody you wouldn't want to mess with.
Absolutely. The demon condottieri.
Yeah.
yep.
So I think he's one of my favorite. He's the only one I've seen so far that was a straight stone cold peasant that then made a very successful living as a condottieri.
He also was routinely the commander of the Bolognese mountain troops as well,
Right.
right? Like, I mean,
Right.
that was kind of his get and go.
That was his thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was a
So
badass.
let's talk condottieri here. Who's your favorite condottieri, Greg?
So mine is Bartolomeo Colleoni.
You picked a good
because
one. Yeah.
because he is the guy who beats the system. So, the Condottieri bios are great because every single one of them is like a movie or an adventure
yeah,
novel
dude,
waiting
so true,
Absolutely.
dude. So true.
combined with The Godfather, right? Because
Okay, right. So it's not just me. It
No,
really
no,
does
no,
seem like
no.
everything is a
no,
Godfather
the,
beginning.
the whole
again.
thing feels like you're in the mob. I mean,
Yeah,
one
okay.
of my
All right.
one of my favorite Condottieri stories is actually in Ferrara in 1409. It's actually outside of Ferrara, but it's with Niccolo d'Este, Fiore's patron. The same year Flower of Battle's written. No connection to Fiore, but it's the whole bit where he's got Sforza, the elder Sforza, as his chief condottiero,
Uh-huh.
and they're going to negotiate with, I think it's Ottobuono, right? So Good Eights, which doesn't that sound like a mobster
That's
name
the
right
most
there?
mob name ever.
Gonna
Yeah.
go meet up with Good Eights, and like Nicolo's like totally, he's totally sick of dealing with this dude. He's just a thorn in his frickin' side. This is a fight over yet again Parma and Reggio, and so they show up, and Sforza, being being from a family of horse ranchers, had this quirk where he used to like to ride unbroken horses to show what a great horseman he is. So they have this agreement. We're each going to bring like two guys with us, and that's it. Maybe it's three, but it's just a small group of guys. They go to this meeting, and Sforza's horse starts bucking and jerking around, and it's riding. Like, well, what the hell is he doing? And Nicolo's like, hey, it's Sforza. You know how he is. And so his horse is bucking and riding around, and they're negotiating. And then all of a sudden, Sforza, who's flopping around the field on his horse, comes up alongside Ottobuono in complete control of his horse, wraps his arm around his neck, and plunges a dagger in his chest and just kills him right on the spot.
Dude.
And it was like, I mean, he might as well have said, "You disappoint me, Fredo." So, it was, so it's, and then his kid goes ahead and manages to totally blackmail his way into being Duke of Milan. I mean, they're great. But Colleoni, what's cool about him is that, he starts off as this minor noble. He's born in 1400, I think. Yeah, 1400 to 70, 75, something like that. And things start off bad with another very condottieri thing. One branch of the family trying to whack you to take your shit.
Yep.
And he is, according to legend, he's like off in the hills with this priest. I'll let you speculate. When the move gets made on his family and they try to burn the house out, and he flees into Milanese territory to other family to protect himself, and he's young. He's young. He's like he's, I don't know, like 12, something like that. But so basically, he loses everything very early on, and he manages to eventually, after a couple of other misadventures, make his way south, and he ends up both working for Sforza for a time, and then what's his name? Arm of the Strong Arms, Braccio.
Braccio da Montone.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Sforza's kind of bête noir.
Right.
And so he ultimately serves under both of them at different points in time, learning both of their two sets of tactics. So both the like all on hard cavalry charge, heavy cavalry charge, and the kind of dispersed attack. And he gets really good at both. And then he has a crazy freaking career that involves, literally shit like he's a prisoner in a castle and he literally opens his own wounds so that they'll bleed, so they bring him more bandages, then takes the bandages off and makes a rope and climbs down, mugs a monk for his robe, and gets out of town, um he marries an heiress, but he's also got a courtesan in Venice who who has a thing with, who gets upset with him and hires an assassin to kill him. He manages to become Captain General of Venice and not get killed by the Venetians, which is like the ultimate achievement ever.
That's
amazing.
amazing. Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
because really, if there's any lesson, it's don't work for Venice. It never
Yeah.
goes well.
Everybody hates them.
Yeah, and they always, if you're their commander, you always end up blind castrated and in a dungeon somewhere. So like,
Yeah.
but he, not only does he pull that off, he gets all of his land in Bergamo. He brings all these incredible painters there to paint frescoes. He creates a school and a dowry system for women who have no dowry, because he had only daughters. And then, of course, he manages to not only, die as their captain general, but he gets this promise from them that they're going to take care of his family, give them this stipend, and they're going to put a statue of him in the Piazza San Marco, where even the doges don't get statues.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
it's like the biggest statue ever.
Yeah,
It's
and
done,
now,
too.
right, it's this huge bronze equestrian statue. I've seen it. It is not in the Piazza San Marco, because they do everything else they promised, and then they're like, he's dead. He won't know the difference. And they actually, it's about the equivalent of like 3 blocks away. So he doesn't end up in the Piazza San Marco, but I love him because he was very good at what he did. He certainly, compared to some of these Condottieri, was far less of a sociopath. And he actually dies of old age.
Old age. That's the ultimate win
Yeah.
right there.
It is.
Yeah.
Die rich and of old age.
And
Yeah.
didn't die of syphilis.
And
Amazing.
if you've ever seen that equestrian statue, he's got a face of a guy who looks really pissed off.
Oh, he does. He really looks kind of constipated. Like I can't tell.
He,
Is
he, he
angry
does.
or constipated?
Or angry because you're constipated. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so I'll give my favorite Condottieri, and it's gonna kind of, it's another face that you might see if you're in the in the square of St. Mark's. So it's Lucio Malvezzi, and the reason why.
That's it. All right.
Yeah, so I had to go with Malvezzi just because of where my current area of study is, but I love Malvezzi for his brief stint, of brilliance. So I'm not going to get too much into the weeds and details about his early history, but basically after the start of the League of Cambrai, Malvezzi proves himself to be a total badass. So he starts out at the Battle of Agnadello and saves the Venetian overseer of his company from certain death from the French, gets him away, manages to take his entire force away from the Battle of Agnadello and get them into Brescia in good order, which, if you know anything about that battle, nothing after that battle happened in good order. So it's
No.
it's an impressive feat. But then it gets better because in the siege of Padua that happens, Francesco Gonzaga is coming up to the city of Padua, and he's trying to get into the link up with the imperial forces. And
Speaking
Malvezzi,
of syphilis, by the way.
Right. Seriously.
everybody had syphilis in this period. I have yet to find somebody that didn't die
I don't think my hero
syphilitic
did.
symptoms.
My Condottieri did not.
No, he didn't. Yeah. So either way, Francesco Gonzaga is coming up, and Malvezzi hears about the fact that Gonzaga is on his way, and so he sends a captain of Stradiotti out to go and meet him. And this captain is like, "Hey, I want to surrender." So Malvezzi's or Gonzaga's like, yeah, absolutely, you can surrender, go get your men, come back, lay down your arms, and you can surrender to me, and then you can join my forces. So he goes back to Malvezzi. Malvezzi and his men kind of ride down. They grab a bunch of peasants from the city of Padua, intersperse them amongst their troops, so it looks like they have their camp followers as well. So they're bringing their families. They ride into Gonzaga's camp, and then basically, you know, Gonzaga thinks that they're going to surrender. They don't. They pull out their weapons. They start just hacking down Gonzaga's men. Gonzaga is in the middle of the night. They do this, and then you know, Gonzaga's sleeping. He jumps out of the back window completely naked and runs through a field and is eventually captured by a peasant. But just all these badass things. He goes head to head with the Chevalier Bayard, who's, you know, one of the more famous French knights. You know, and just ruse after ruse after ruse, and I feel like there's like a 5-year period where Malvezzi was just absolutely on fire. So
And how's it all end for him?
he dies of syphilis.
There you go. There you go. I noticed you were trying to not.
Trying to work around that one.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
That's the part we were all waiting for.
He does end up having a very shitty spell as the commander general of the Venetian forces, but
When the syphilis had got to him.
that's probably why the syphilis got to him. Yes, we can put that in air quotes and it'll make more sense.
Never become commander general of the Venetian forces.
Also, don't dip your wick in the Venetian delights. That's probably another
Good plan.
Yeah, because the Venetians, I found out through some of our research, were actually very well known for having some of the best, and having the sex industry in Venice was one of the most prominent things about their economy.
Right?
From an internal perspective, like from an actual, like, in Venice, that was like primary driver of their economy. That was super
I guess
interesting.
they did that and blow glass, huh?
Yeah. So.
Cool. Yeah, that's some great stories about the Condottieri. So that's kind of going to be our focus for a while here. Is we got just tons of these great stories, like you said, each one reading like a Hollywood movie mixed with The Godfather. So.
Oh, absolutely. But it also shows part of what makes Italy so unique in, you know, the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries compared to the rest of Europe is that the Condottieri are proof that there is a degree of social upward mobility through arms.
Yeah,
that
totally.
is just, you know, people make a big deal about like Hawkwood being knighted, Robert Knowles being knighted in the 100 Years' War by Edward, and that's true. Certainly, that would have never happened in France. But, you know, in Italy, you've got people like, you know, Gattamelata and a lot of these guys who come from just nothing. And they are ruling cities and commanding major armies in the field. And, I mean, that just would have been unthinkable.
Yeah, it was really about virtue above all else. Like, you just do all of what you can do, and you kind of, the cream rises to the top. They just had too many, I think they had too many chefs in the kitchen is the big problem in Italy. Nobody could agree who was in charge, so they were all squabbling.
Yes. And, you know, that remained Italy's problem right up until unification. And really, this
still now.
Many of them would tell you, yeah. It's nice to be the first to tell you that. Oh, there's one Italy? You're so cute. They always tell me that when I get there. You know, actually, that's maybe the last thing that's worth mentioning about that period is this idea of virtu, which comes from the Roman virtus. Because everyone, whenever I give lectures on that, people are like, oh yeah, virtue. Well, these guys don't sound very virtuous. But of course, it doesn't mean what we mean by virtuous, which is to be this kind of, you know, moral paragon. It means to live life to your fullest potential and with a personal honesty. You know, like the Romans considered Mark Antony to be a perfect exemplar of virtus. I don't think the Romans thought he was a particularly moral guy. That wasn't really the point, right?
Right.
But, John Galeazzo Visconti was hardly virtuous, but he did almost unite all of Italy under him because he was brilliant and he knew how to play the game. So these guys, right, this idea of virtue, of basically, you know, stepping up and daring to do
it
and
all,
be
be a
more.
badass.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It all comes from that word vir, from Rome, from Latin. Right, exactly. To be a true man as opposed to a mere mere womo. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing because it's not a notion we really have now. But I think when you understand that, you also understand like why is it more important to show up and fight a duel even if it ends up inconclusive, right? Why is it important to show up and fight in these armored deeds even though like no winner's chosen? Because it's about the doing of the thing, and it's very different from how we look at things today. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Greg, we're gonna have to have you back on some point. Maybe we can just do nothing but go back and forth on Condottieri stories. I think that.
I can almost picture that we could be called like blood, death, and syphilis.
Blood, death, and syphilis, the life and times of the Condottieri.
Exactly. And 15th century popes.
And
Oh God!
Yeah.
Oh God!
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I got the impression with Italy that, if you have 3 Italians, there's 2 conspiracies, unless one of them's a cardinal, and then there's 4.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And by 1527, they all have syphilis. So yeah.
Oh man! All right. Well,
So,
Greg,
all right.
thanks again.
Thanks,
Thanks
Greg.
for coming on. Appreciate it.